Good evening. Tonight we will drift into the quiet corridors of an ancient world, following the rhythms of life in a time long past. As we settle into this story, let us step gently into the atmosphere of Egypt during the reign of Queen Cleopatra, not in moments of turmoil or dramatic conquest, but in the quiet stretches of her everyday existence. The first light of morning in Alexandria arrived not with sudden brilliance, but with a gradual unfolding. The sun, climbing above the horizon of the eastern Mediterranean, poured its radiance through the pale haze that hovered over the city. At dawn, the harbor lay hushed, the waters shifting slowly, touched by thin streaks of gold. Ships rocked with muted creaks against the stone piers, their sails still furled, their shadows stretching long and blue across the quays. The air was heavy with mingled scents: salt from the sea, tar from the ropes, smoke from the first hearths being kindled within the city walls. Alexandria, the Pearl of Egypt, spread in deliberate order. Wide avenues paved with smooth stone, colonnades stretching in disciplined rows, and buildings that blended Egyptian solidity with Hellenistic grace. Marble facades caught the light unevenly, the carved capitals of pillars casting fine webs of shadow upon the walls. Along narrow alleys, morning sounds stirred: the call of a seller unpacking figs and olives, the clip of a donkey's hooves echoing against the stone, the rustle of linen as women carried jars of water drawn at dawn from the cisterns. The great lighthouse, the Pharos, stood as it had for generations, a sentinel of stone and flame. Its tower was etched against the pale sky, its upper fire still dim in the retreating night. Even from the palace quarter, the lighthouse was visible, a constant reminder that the city was both gateway and prize, the center through which the lifeblood of the Nile's riches met the trade of the wider Mediterranean. Within the palace precinct itself, the morning unfolded more softly, with slower rhythms. The gardens that stretched between the colonnaded halls were brushed with dew. Fragrant blossoms opened cautiously under the first warmth, their scent mingling with the cool dampness of stone. Walkways were swept before the queen would stir, their gravel smoothed into evenness by careful hands. The pools that reflected columns and sky were still, broken only by the glide of fish beneath their calm surfaces. Cleopatra, still resting in her chamber, would awaken not to noise or hurried calls, but to the faintest stirrings. The whisper of fabric as servants arranged themselves discreetly at the edges of the room, the muted crackle of oil lamps being extinguished, the faint fragrance of crushed herbs set into shallow bowls to freshen the air. The chamber itself was expansive but not austere. Walls were painted with scenes of lotus blossoms, river reeds, and celestial symbols, their colors softened by the dim light of dawn. Draperies of fine linen shifted slightly in the sea breeze that crept through carved lattice screens. When she rose, it was not with suddenness. Ritual and composure marked even the smallest beginnings of her day. A basin of cool water, drawn from a nearby cistern and perfumed with petals, would be placed nearby. The chill upon her skin was both awakening and cleansing, a reminder of the Nile's eternal gift. Ivory combs smoothed her dark hair, while oils, pressed from almonds, sesame, and fragrant myrrh, were rubbed gently into her skin. Each gesture, carried out by practiced hands, belonged to the long traditions of queenship, echoing generations before her. Her attire for the early hours was not the ceremonial grandeur of public life, but something more measured. Fine linen robes, bleached to near transparency by the sun, wrapped about her with folds so light they seemed to float. Jewels were absent at first. Only later in the day would the deliberate layering of adornment commence. For now, simplicity marked the passage from sleep into wakefulness. Through arched windows, the sea breathed softly. From her vantage point, Cleopatra could observe the city coming to life. Market stalls blossomed in the squares, and priests in white garments ascended temple steps to greet the morning sun. The Nile, flowing silently beyond the city, carried boats heavy with grain and papyrus, their sails like pale wings against the horizon. This steady rhythm of commerce and devotion was the unseen foundation upon which her reign rested. Not the grand battles remembered in distant chronicles, but the patient cycles of cultivation, exchange, and faith. The palace itself was a city within a city. Corridors led into libraries where scrolls of knowledge were kept in careful order, their papyrus rolls scented faintly of cedar. Courtyards opened to sunlight and fountains, while hidden chambers stored the supplies and treasures that sustained both court and kingdom. The presence of the queen was felt not through loud proclamations but through the steady attention of those who served her. Scribes bent over tablets, stewards moving quietly with accounts of grain and tribute, and attendants who ensured that light and air moved freely through the vast structures. Morning meals were delicate affairs. A tray of figs, dates, and honey might be brought forward, accompanied by freshly baked bread, light cheeses, and diluted wine. The flavors were gentle, chosen not to weigh heavily upon the mind in its first hours. Sometimes there were pomegranates, their seeds like jewels, their taste sharp and refreshing. All of it was set not upon gold but upon polished wood, the beauty lying in the arrangement rather than ostentation. As the day stretched outward, Cleopatra would attend not to warfare or sudden decrees, but to the measured pulse of governance. Scribes would unroll papyrus scrolls before her, reading reports of the grain harvest, the repair of irrigation channels, the state of temple endowments. Their words, rhythmic and unhurried, wove a tapestry of the kingdom's health. She listened not with restless impatience but with deliberate calm, weighing the balance of resources, noting the subtle shifts in the needs of cities and villages far beyond Alexandria's marble avenues. The atmosphere of the chamber in which such matters were heard was hushed, broken only by the scratching of reed pens and the soft fall of sandals upon polished floors. Light filtered through high openings, catching in motes of dust that drifted like pale smoke. The faint scent of papyrus mixed with the resin of burning incense. In such settings, the immense structure of power revealed itself not as a loud force, but as a quiet accumulation of careful decisions. Beyond these inner tasks lay the gardens once more, and it was here that the queen often moved during the later morning hours. Pathways shaded by sycamores and palms offered a place of contemplation. Pools mirrored the blue of the sky, and the hum of bees blended with the soft rustle of leaves. The garden was both sanctuary and stage, a place where courtiers might approach with petitions, yet also where solitude could be found amidst fragrance and shade. There was, too, a rhythm of learning and reflection. Tutors and philosophers, drawn from both Greek and Egyptian traditions, would recite passages from histories, poems, and treatises. Their voices rose and fell with the cadence of the ancients, carrying echoes of Homer, Herodotus, and sacred hymns to Isis. Cleopatra listened, questioned, and sometimes paused to write her own notes in wax tablets, the stylus scratching lightly across the surface. Knowledge was not gathered in haste but absorbed slowly, like sunlight upon stone. By midday, the city beyond the palace walls would have grown restless in heat. The marble streets shimmered under the weight of the sun, and the air above the harbor quivered with warmth. Market stalls were shaded with woven reeds. Merchants dozed in brief repose. Donkeys, laden with amphorae of oil and jars of grain, moved more slowly through the avenues. Yet within the palace, shade and water maintained a gentler climate. Draperies filtered the light into softened hues. Fountains splashed with steady murmurs. Polished stone remained cool underfoot. The queen's meal at this hour reflected the balance between luxury and moderation. Dishes of lentils with herbs, grilled fish fresh from the Mediterranean, cucumbers steeped in vinegar, and breads flavored with coriander might appear upon low tables. Wine, drawn from amphorae and diluted with water, was poured sparingly. The taste of each item was savored quietly, without rush, as if the very act of nourishment was a meditation. After the meal, time softened into a slower pace. Some afternoons were given to audiences, visitors bearing gifts from distant lands, envoys speaking of alliances, traders offering exotic wares. Others unfolded in more private silence, with readings from the library, or music played on lyres and flutes within shaded halls. The sound of music drifted gently through colonnades, a ripple of harmony that mingled with the cooing of doves. Cleopatra's presence was marked not by constant movement, but by composure. Her gestures were measured, her words chosen with precision. Observers often remarked upon her gaze, steady and contemplative, as though she saw both the detail before her and the larger pattern into which it fit. This calm intensity, cultivated across years, shaped the very atmosphere of the palace, where even the smallest tasks were performed with deliberate grace. As shadows lengthened in the later afternoon, the light within the city grew softer. The harbor glowed with a pale sheen, sails gilded by the setting sun. The sounds of the marketplace rose again as traders sought to sell the last of their goods before nightfall. The fragrance of roasting meats and spice stews drifted from the kitchens of common homes. In the distance, temple bells marked the hours, their tones carrying across rooftops with measured clarity. Within the palace, preparations for evening began quietly. Lamps were trimmed and filled with fresh oil, their wicks curled neatly. Draperies were drawn against the cooling sea air. Attendants arranged low couches, embroidered cloths, and bowls of fruit, setting the stage for evening meals and conversations. The transition from day to night was not abrupt, but a gentle shading, like ink spreading gradually across parchment. Night itself brought a different rhythm. Stars appeared above the city, sharp and luminous in the dry air. The constellations of both Greek and Egyptian tradition traced their patterns across the sky, symbols of stories older than memory. From the lighthouse, the beacon fire glowed, guiding ships even as silence settled upon the waters. Within the queen's chamber, the final rituals of the day unfolded. The washing of hands and feet in perfumed water, the braiding of hair, the placement of amulets against the skin for protection and blessing. The bed, draped in linen cooled by the evening breeze, awaited in quiet simplicity. As Cleopatra lay down, the hum of the city softened to a lull, and the slow rhythms of sleep folded once more into the life of the palace. Thus a single day passed, not with tumult, but with the steady grace of ordered hours. And though history would remember Cleopatra for alliances, wars, and legends that blurred into myth, there remained, beneath it all, this cadence of ordinary yet extraordinary days. The quiet rising of morning, the measured tasks of governance, the contemplative hours of study, and the serene descent of night. Within the palace complex of Alexandria, the first movements of the day belonged not to the queen herself, but to those whose quiet labor formed the hidden structure of her world. The corridors, long before sunlight reached their inner recesses, filled with the subdued footsteps of attendants. Linen garments brushed faintly against stone. Bronze vessels clinked softly as water was carried in careful procession from cisterns and fountains. The servants moved with practiced rhythm, not hurried, yet never idle. In the still half-light, they swept corridors with bundles of palm fibers, leaving behind a faint fragrance of dust mingled with the resin of oil lamps. Wooden doors, carved with lotus patterns, were opened to admit the first breezes of the sea. Curtains were shaken gently so that night's heaviness would lift. Such motions, repeated daily, contained a dignity of their own, acts unseen by most, but essential to the serenity of the palace. Some among the attendants carried trays of offerings toward the small shrines within the complex. At these altars, dedicated to Isis, to Hathor, and to the household spirits, were placed fresh garlands, bowls of milk, figs, and small cakes scented with honey. Lamps were refilled with oil, their flames coaxed back into life so that light would never vanish entirely from these sanctuaries. The air in such chambers was cool, touched with incense that rose in slow spirals, clinging to the painted walls and gilded statues. In the women's quarters, a quiet hum of activity unfolded. Servants prepared vessels of perfumed water, blending crushed herbs, rose petals, and resin into the basins. Linen robes were laid out on low couches, smoothed carefully so that no fold seemed careless. Ivory combs were polished, cosmetics arranged, coal in small alabaster jars, red ochre ground to a fine dust, and small bottles containing oils pressed from almonds and olives. Each item bore not only a practical purpose but a symbolic one, a continuity with generations who had performed these same gestures in service to the royal household. Musicians, too, stirred at this hour, though their role would come later. They tuned their lyres and lutes quietly, plucking strings with such delicacy that the sound was barely audible beyond their chamber. The faint notes mingled with the muffled cooing of doves kept in aviaries within the palace gardens. For Cleopatra, music was not mere diversion, but a rhythm that accompanied reflection and study, a pattern that shaped the atmosphere of her days. Thus, the musician's preparation, though invisible in the early hours, became part of the day's unfolding harmony. Beyond the inner quarters, guards moved in steady patterns along colonnades and gates. Their sandals struck the stone in even cadence, spears upright, eyes scanning both outward toward the harbor and inward toward the palace gardens. Bronze helmets caught the early light. Shields rested against walls when not carried. They were not only protectors but symbols. Their presence reminded all who entered that the queen's world, though serene, was secured by vigilance. In the library halls nearby, scribes arrived early. The scent of papyrus and ink already filled those spaces, heavy yet familiar. They sat before low desks of polished wood, reed pens sharpened and ready. Scrolls were unrolled, their texts checked for damage, the edges repaired with glue where needed. Some copied ancient hymns, their hands steady, while others prepared reports that would later reach the queen. Lists of grain shipments from the Nile Delta, accounts of taxes collected in Thebes, inventories of oil amphorae waiting in the harbor. Each stroke of ink upon papyrus was a small thread in the vast fabric of governance. Among the cooks, fires were kindled in the kitchens. Clay ovens glowed as bread was set to bake, the aroma of leavened dough rising in the warm air. Figs were sliced, dates softened in water, and fresh fish laid upon bronze griddles. The bustle here was louder, yet even this noise was contained within rhythm. Ladles stirred stews with circular precision. Knives struck cutting boards in measured pace. Each meal that appeared upon a polished tray in the queen's chamber was the result of this unseen choreography. The gardeners, too, had their share in the palace's harmony. At dawn they moved among pools and shaded paths, pruning with bronze shears, lifting fallen leaves, tending to the lotus blooms that floated like stars upon the water. Their task was not only to preserve beauty, but to maintain the balance between wilderness and order. In the silence of early hours, one could hear the splash of water as they drew it from stone channels, guiding it to roots thirsty from the night. Messengers began their routes as well. Some carried sealed tablets from distant provinces, wrapped in twine and stamped with wax. Others prepared to ride toward the city's outer districts, bearing words of command or requests for supplies. Their sandals were sturdy, their cloaks light for travel. Though their movements were swifter than those within the palace walls, they, too, were part of the greater rhythm. Words in motion, carrying the reach of Alexandria outward into Egypt and beyond. All these layers of quiet work formed the ground upon which Cleopatra's day unfolded. By the time she entered her gardens or sat to listen to reports, the unseen multitude had already shaped the palace into readiness. Their efforts were not marked by triumph or spectacle, yet they carried an enduring weight. Each servant smoothing linen, each scribe bending over a scroll, each guard pacing a shaded walkway contributed to an atmosphere of composure and continuity that allowed a single figure to embody the vastness of a kingdom. As the sun climbed higher, shadows shortened across the marble courts. The palace grew warmer, yet its inner chambers remained cool, protected by thick stone and shaded colonnades. The hum of daily life, servants passing with trays, guards exchanging quiet words, the distant notes of music, melded into a subdued harmony. Here, in the interplay of silence and small sounds, the real heartbeat of power revealed itself, not in sudden proclamations, but in steady order. It was in this web of unseen actions that Cleopatra's presence gained its meaning. When she walked through colonnades, the floors gleamed because attendants had swept them before dawn. When she consulted a scroll, the words upon it existed because scribes had labored in the dim light of early hours. When she looked upon the gardens, they flourished because careful hands had drawn water from channels. Each moment of her day was thus both personal and collective, woven from the labor of many whose names history rarely preserved. In such a world, even silence was cultivated. The palace was not empty but filled with layered sound, soft footsteps, rustling linen, trickling water, whispered reports. Yet the effect was one of calm rather than noise. It was an environment shaped to allow thought, reflection, and the slow unfolding of decisions. As the queen prepared once more to receive her attendants, the palace already breathed with ordered vitality. And so the hours moved forward, not in haste, but with deliberate grace, as if the entire city conspired to maintain the rhythm of one woman's reign. Within the palace, the morning gradually shifted into a new rhythm once the queen herself had risen fully into the day. The quiet preparations of attendants gave way to the more deliberate unfolding of her personal routine. Light filtered into her chamber, softened by curtains of fine linen, casting pale patterns across polished stone. A gentle fragrance lingered in the air, a blend of crushed petals and burning resin, carefully chosen to sharpen clarity of mind without overwhelming the senses. The queen's attendants arranged themselves with precision, each one knowing the sequence of tasks that accompanied her first hours. They moved in silence or with only the faintest whispers, their gestures refined by repetition and custom. One servant lifted a shallow tray upon which stood slender vessels of oil, almond, myrrh, and lotus, each with its own subtle hue and scent. Another smoothed the folds of her robe, ensuring that the fabric fell in long, unbroken lines that caught the light with quiet dignity. Cosmetics, though not yet applied in full ceremony, were touched lightly at this stage. A small pot of dark kohl was opened, the fine powder pressed gently with a slender stick so that her gaze, already steady, gained definition. A faint red pigment made from crushed ochre was prepared, though used sparingly. Each detail was executed not for vanity alone, but for symbolism. The appearance of the queen was a mirror of harmony, balance, and continuity with the gods. Once these preparations had been carried out, a light meal was brought forward. A low table, carved of cedar and inlaid with ivory, was set within reach. Upon it lay figs, their skins dark and soft, pomegranates cut open to reveal their jeweled seeds, bread still warm from the ovens, its surface brushed with sesame. A dish of fresh cheese, pale and cool, rested beside bowls of olives preserved in brine. Honey, thick and golden, glistened in a small jar, to be taken with morsels of bread. A carafe of diluted wine, mixed with water drawn earlier from the cistern, completed the arrangement. Cleopatra partook of this breakfast slowly, savoring each taste with composure. She did not consume heavily in the early hours, preferring foods that refreshed the body and sharpened the mind. Servants waited nearby, ready to replace a plate or refill a cup, though they did so with discretion, their movements nearly silent. To watch the queen eat was to witness not indulgence, but measured grace. Each act carried the rhythm of someone accustomed to both private reflection and public display. While she ate, scribes sometimes approached, bearing reports that could not wait until later hours. They bowed deeply, unfurling scrolls of papyrus, their voices low and steady as they recited figures of grain shipments or the tally of ships arriving in harbor. Cleopatra listened with attentive calm, pausing between mouthfuls to absorb the details. Her gaze, direct yet serene, rested upon each scribe long enough to impress both acknowledgement and expectation. Notes were taken by others, the stylus scratching softly against wax tablets. Thus, even the simplest meal became an extension of governance. The queen's gestures during these moments revealed much about her character. She leaned neither hastily forward nor back in languor, but sat upright, her hands moving with clarity. When she broke bread, she did so carefully, dividing portions with precision. When she tasted fruit, she considered its flavor as though measuring its quality, perhaps reflecting upon the fertility of the lands from which it had come. Her presence made ordinary foods seem bound to the wider fate of the kingdom. Once the meal concluded, the remnants were cleared away with swift efficiency. Servants lifted the trays, wiped the table, and departed without disturbance. The queen's hands were washed once more. Water poured slowly from a bronze vessel into a shallow basin. A linen cloth, soft and cool, was presented for drying. These gestures, though simple, reinforced the sense of ritual that shaped the flow of her day. Nothing was done abruptly, nothing without a rhythm of beginning and conclusion. Following this, attention turned toward the more elaborate preparation of her appearance. The cosmetics applied earlier in delicate touches were now completed. Kohl was drawn with greater care, extending slightly at the edges of her eyes in the traditional style, its lines precise. Pigments were brushed across her lips and cheeks, their tones subtle but enhancing. A crown or headdress, not always the most formal diadem, was placed upon her hair, its weight adjusted carefully by skilled hands so that it rested in balance. Jewelry, armlets, rings, and earrings of gold inlaid with turquoise or lapis was chosen according to the nature of the day's tasks. Throughout this process, Cleopatra remained composed, speaking little, her expression steady. The attendants who dressed her had worked for years in her presence, and their familiarity ensured that each gesture was both efficient and reverent. The sound of bracelets clasping, of beads sliding against one another, of fabric rustling softly filled the chamber. In these quiet sounds, the grandeur of monarchy was made tangible, not through ceremony before the masses, but through the intimate rituals of adornment. Once prepared, she moved from her private chamber into the more public spaces of the palace. The transition was subtle. The air shifted, carrying with it the scent of incense burning in the colonnades. The light grew brighter as she passed into open courtyards. Guards adjusted their stance as she approached, their spears upright, their gaze forward. Attendants walked a few steps behind, bearing scrolls, tablets, and small chests of seals and writing instruments. The queen's day was now fully begun, and with it the intricate weaving of governance, ritual, and reflection. Yet beneath the layers of ritual, her actions retained a quality of measured humanity. She paused sometimes to adjust the fold of her robe, or to glance briefly at the garden beyond a colonnade where lotus flowers floated upon the water. Such moments, fleeting and private, existed alongside the weight of queenship, revealing the delicate balance between ruler and woman, between myth and daily life. The palace continued its rhythm around her, yet all movements seemed subtly shaped by her presence. Servants aligned their pace with hers. Scribes adjusted their voices to her tone. Even the guard's steps seemed to echo her composure. It was as though the entire household mirrored her steadiness, creating an atmosphere where each action, no matter how small, carried the impression of deliberate order. And thus, as the morning deepened, Cleopatra's day unfolded with the calm strength of ritual, sustained by the unseen labor of many, yet defined by the quiet grace of her own gestures. After the quiet conclusion of her morning hours, Cleopatra's day moved gently into the domain of thought and study. The palace, still alive with the hum of activity, seemed to shift its center of gravity. Where earlier the focus had been upon the ordering of garments, the arrangement of foods, and the rhythm of household duties, now it turned toward the intellect and the slow unfolding of knowledge. Light from the high sun filtered through latticed stone, softened by hanging draperies, leaving patterns of shifting brightness upon the floors. Courtyards filled with warmth, yet shaded corridors offered a cooler refuge, where footsteps echoed softly between columns. Along these passages, attendants carried scrolls and wax tablets, their arms filled with knowledge written by many hands across centuries. The queen often received philosophers and tutors in chambers designed not for display, but for measured conversation. These rooms were lined with shelves upon which papyrus scrolls rested in careful order. The faint scent of cedar oil, used to preserve the manuscripts, mingled with the sharper odor of ink. Light entered from narrow openings above, illuminating dust that drifted like golden haze. Cushions were laid upon the floor, and low tables bore vessels of water and small trays of figs for refreshment. Cleopatra entered such spaces with the same composure that marked her movements elsewhere. Her robe, simple yet dignified, fell about her with deliberate folds. She seated herself with poise, attendants taking their place discreetly at the edges of the chamber, while the philosophers bowed before speaking. Their voices rose and fell in steady cadence, carrying the echoes of Greece, of Egypt, of lands farther still. There were discussions of astronomy, where the movements of the stars were traced upon wax tablets with stylus marks. Maps of the heavens, inked in careful lines, were unrolled and studied. The queen's gaze followed the patterns, her questions quiet but precise, as she weighed how the cycles of the constellations mirrored the cycles of the Nile and the festivals of the temples. To her, the heavens were not distant abstractions, but rhythms that bound human life to divine order. At other times, the talk turned to philosophy. Greek texts were recited, their words flowing with the balance of reason and metaphor. The works of Plato and Aristotle mingled with Egyptian hymns, their tones both contrasting and complementing one another. Cleopatra listened with an intensity that stilled the room, her expression calm yet alert. She did not merely absorb, but engaged, shaping her thoughts with the precision of one accustomed to rule not only through decree but through understanding. Scribes recorded portions of these conversations, their pens scratching upon fresh scrolls, ensuring that the queen's words and the responses of her tutors would not be lost. Their movements were careful, for in their hands lay the preservation of thought itself, fragile as papyrus yet enduring through written memory. Beyond philosophy and astronomy lay medicine and natural science. Physicians presented dried herbs, roots, and minerals, explaining their properties with measured care. They demonstrated the preparation of salves, perfumes, and tinctures, noting how each substance might soothe, heal, or purify. Cleopatra observed with interest, her fingers sometimes lifting a sprig of dried plant to feel its texture, or holding a vial of oil to catch its scent. Such knowledge was not idle curiosity but part of her identity as queen, for the health of both body and spirit was woven deeply into the practice of Egyptian kingship. In the later part of the afternoon, she often moved to the palace gardens, where discussions could continue beneath the shade of trees. The murmur of water from fountains softened the air, while bees hummed among blossoms. Scrolls were unrolled upon stone benches, their words read aloud while the scent of flowering lotus drifted upward. Birds moved in the branches above, their calls faint and scattered, blending with the voices of the learned. Sometimes the queen walked slowly among the paths, attendants following at a respectful distance, while philosophers accompanied her steps. She asked questions not in haste, but in tones that invited reflection. How did the winds shift across the seasons? Why did the Nile rise with such constancy? And what hidden patterns guided its floods? Were the stars immutable, or did they too possess a rhythm of change? Each inquiry was not only a pursuit of knowledge, but also a meditation upon order itself. As the hours advanced, the library itself became a destination. Within its vast halls, scrolls numbering in the thousands were stored, collected from distant ports and kingdoms. The air there was heavy with the scent of papyrus and dust, yet also with the aura of reverence. Rows of shelves stretched into shadow, broken only by the glow of oil lamps. Custodians moved quietly, guiding visitors to texts, repairing bindings, or copying fragile documents onto fresh material. Cleopatra walked among these shelves with deliberate pace, her hand sometimes brushing the edge of a scroll as though acknowledging its presence. She did not read each herself, for the number was beyond measure, but she directed scribes to bring forward particular works. Histories of foreign lands, records of older dynasties, hymns to forgotten gods. She knew that within these texts lay fragments of understanding, each one a piece of the great mosaic of human thought. Occasionally she paused at a desk where scribes bent over their work, their lamps glowing upon polished wood. The sound of their pens, steady and repetitive, filled the silence like soft rain. Ink stained their fingers, yet they worked without distraction, aware that their efforts would one day shape what others remembered of this age. The queen's presence among them lent weight to their labor, transforming copying into an act of continuity with eternity. By the time the sun began to lower, the air within the palace had grown cooler. Shadows lengthened across the courtyards, and the intensity of study gave way once more to calm reflection. The queen withdrew from the library, her attendants gathering scrolls and tablets, her philosophers bowing as they took their leave. The day's learning did not conclude abruptly but dissolved into stillness, like ink spreading gently into water. Within her private chamber once more, the queen sat quietly before the open lattice, gazing toward the sea. The horizon, touched by the glow of evening, seemed to mirror the vastness of thought explored during the day. Knowledge and rule, study and governance, ritual and reflection, all blended into a single rhythm, as steady and enduring as the waves upon the shore. And thus her afternoon passed, not with noise or spectacle, but with the calm pursuit of wisdom, shaping her presence as queen not only through command, but through understanding of the order woven into the world itself. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, Alexandria entered its quieter hours. The brilliance of day softened into muted gold, and the long colonnades of the palace stretched with shadows that lengthened across polished stone. Sea breezes, cooler now, drifted through open courtyards, carrying with them the faint scent of salt and tar from the harbor mixed with the sweeter perfume of flowering trees in the gardens. Within the palace, preparations turned gently toward the evening meal. The kitchens, hidden in the deeper wings of the complex, glowed with the steady heat of their clay ovens. Fires had been tended since late afternoon, their embers coaxed into warmth so that bread could be baked anew, meats roasted slowly, and stews simmered in bronze vessels. The air was rich with mingled aromas, coriander and cumin crushed into pastes, garlic roasted until sweet, fish seared lightly, and figs stewed in honey. The cooks moved with quiet efficiency, their gestures shaped by years of practice. Wooden ladles stirred, knives struck against boards with rhythm, and servants passed from chamber to chamber with trays balanced carefully upon their hands. In the great dining chamber, attendants spread cloths of woven linen across low tables, smoothing the fabric until no crease disturbed its surface. Bronze and silver vessels were polished until they caught the glow of oil lamps with a subdued gleam. Amphorae of wine were placed discreetly at the edges of the room, their clay surfaces stamped with seals that marked both origin and quality. Bowls of fruit, dates, pomegranates, and clusters of grapes were arranged with deliberate symmetry, their colors softened by lamplight. The queen entered this space not in sudden ceremony, but with the same calm grace that marked her mornings and afternoons. Her robe, now of deeper hue, caught the glow of lamps with a muted sheen. Jewelry reflected the fading sunlight, turquoise and lapis glimmering faintly against gold. She moved toward the table prepared for her, and attendants stepped forward to guide her seat, though she required little assistance. The meal unfolded slowly, each dish presented in careful succession. Bread, fresh and warm, was broken and dipped into bowls of oil infused with herbs. Fish, seasoned with salt and coriander, was served alongside stewed lentils and cucumbers dressed with vinegar. Roasted meats appeared in modest portions, carved with precision and offered with sauces of pomegranate and honey. Nothing was hurried, nothing excessive. Each taste was savored, not as indulgence, but as part of the rhythm of the evening. Wine was poured, diluted with water in the traditional fashion, ensuring clarity of thought rather than heaviness of spirit. The vessels themselves were simple in shape, their elegance lying in balance rather than ornament. Attendants moved lightly between the tables, refilling cups with measured hands, ensuring that nothing disturbed the harmony of the moment. Music accompanied the meal, gentle and steady. Musicians sat upon low stools near the edge of the chamber, their lyres and flutes sending forth melodies that rose and fell like the cadence of waves. The notes did not intrude upon the conversation but formed a soft background, shaping the air with calm resonance. Occasionally, a harp joined, its strings struck with delicate precision, each tone lingering before fading into silence. The music wove the meal into something beyond nourishment, a meditative ritual where sound, taste, and atmosphere became inseparable. There were stories, too, spoken in measured tones. A courtier might recount a tale from distant lands, describing the merchants of Syria or the ships that traveled from Cyprus laden with copper and timber. Others might share fragments of poetry, recited slowly so that each word carried its weight. These were not performances of drama but reflections, quiet offerings to the queen and those present, meant to nourish the mind as much as food sustained the body. Cleopatra herself listened with serene composure, her gaze steady, her expression thoughtful. She ate without haste, lifting each morsel with a rhythm that echoed the music around her. Sometimes she asked a question of detail, a spice's origin, a merchant's name, the phrasing of a line of verse, but her voice was calm, never disturbing the flow of the gathering. Between courses, basins of perfumed water were brought forward. Attendants poured gently over her hands, and linen cloths were offered for drying. The fragrance of myrrh and rose mingled with the scent of roasted meats and baked bread, refreshing the air before the next dish appeared. Such gestures, repeated with quiet dignity, maintained the balance between richness and restraint. As the meal drew toward its close, fruits and sweet confections were placed upon the tables. Dates stuffed with almonds, honey cakes glazed with sesame, and pomegranates cut open so that their seeds shone like scattered rubies. These were not consumed in haste but tasted slowly, each sweetness balanced by the dryness of diluted wine. By now the lamps had grown brighter against the deepening dusk. Their flames flickered against painted walls, casting long shadows that moved like silent attendants across the stone. The music softened, its final notes trailing into silence, and the voices in the chamber lowered. Conversation ebbed like the tide, leaving behind the quiet satisfaction of fullness, both of body and spirit. Cleopatra rose at last, her attendants stepping forward to gather trays and vessels. She walked with the same measured pace as when she had entered, her presence leaving behind a sense of stillness. The dining chamber, once filled with movement and sound, settled back into silence, its tables cleared, its lamps burning steadily as though holding the memory of the evening. The queen returned to her private chambers, the gardens visible through latticed windows glowing with the faint light of stars. The palace, though never fully asleep, seemed to rest now in its own rhythm. The bustle of kitchens quieted, the voices of servants lowered to whispers. The day that had begun with sunlight and ritual had now entered its final descent, its cadence soft and unbroken. And thus, the evening meal of Cleopatra was not a spectacle of excess, but a meditation of balance. Flavors carefully chosen, music gently played, conversation slow and thoughtful. It was a mirror of her rule itself, composed, deliberate, and woven into the harmony of her surroundings. Night descended over Alexandria with unhurried certainty, the sky darkening into a deep velvet that carried the faint shimmer of distant stars. From the high windows of the palace, the city appeared as a cluster of softened lights, the harbor torches burning like quiet beacons, their flames mirrored in the restless surface of the sea. Beyond the stone walls, the city did not fall silent altogether, yet its sounds changed in character, voices lowered, steps became slower, and the calls of merchants gave way to the hush of waves and the occasional song carried from a distant courtyard. Within the palace itself, preparations for rest unfolded with the same measured grace as the earlier rituals of the day. Servants moved softly through corridors, placing lamps in niches so that their glow remained steady, not harsh. The air cooled, the earlier warmth of the sun having drifted away, leaving behind a faint crispness that seeped through the colonnades. Curtains of woven linen were drawn across open spaces, filtering the night breeze, carrying with it the mingled scents of garden blossoms and faint traces of the sea. In Cleopatra's private chambers, attendants gathered with unspoken coordination. Bronze basins were filled with warm water infused with petals of lotus and rose. When lifted, the surface shimmered with droplets of oil, glistening faintly in lamplight. Small clay jars were set upon low tables, their stoppers removed so that fragrances of myrrh, frankincense, and cinnamon drifted into the air, blending into a calm, enveloping perfume. Ivory combs, polished to a pale sheen, were laid beside folded cloths of fine texture, while jewelry cases of cedar remained partially open, as if in quiet readiness. The queen entered with her measured step, her robe now lighter, its fabric chosen not for ceremony but for ease. Gold and precious stones had been set aside, their weight no longer needed. She moved toward the basin where attendants awaited. With delicate gestures, water was poured over her hands, then her arms, the warmth soothing the skin after the coolness of evening air. Drops slid in rivulets, caught at once by linen cloths held ready. The scent of lotus rose gently, filling the chamber with tranquil sweetness. One attendant unpinned her hair, and dark strands fell free with slow inevitability. Combs of ivory moved through them, each stroke unhurried, drawing out the rhythm of calm. Oil was smoothed between the palms and applied to keep the strands supple, the fragrance faint yet enduring. Another attendant massaged her shoulders lightly with scented oil, fingers tracing patterns meant not to rouse but to relax. The queen closed her eyes briefly, not in sleep, but in acknowledgement of the quieting of the day. The chamber itself was arranged to soothe. Cushions were spread across a low couch draped in linen. Nearby, incense burned in a small bronze vessel, its smoke rising in delicate threads that curled into unseen shapes before vanishing into the air. Lamps glowed from carefully chosen positions, casting soft, elongated shadows along painted walls. Murmurs from attendants were barely audible, words spoken only when needed, their tones subdued. When the cleansing was complete, jewelry stored, hair set loose, and oils applied, Cleopatra moved toward her bed. It stood slightly raised upon a wooden frame, its legs carved into the shapes of lions' paws, its surface layered with woven mats, linen sheets, and a coverlet dyed in muted hues. The linen had been cooled slightly before being placed, so that when she lay upon it, the touch was both fresh and soft. Around the bed, curtains of fine gauze could be drawn, offering privacy and softening the lamplight into a golden haze. Before she rested, certain objects were brought forth. A small amulet of polished stone, shaped to represent protection, was placed upon a low table near the bed. Another charm, bound with a thread of red, was laid beside her pillow. These were not mere ornaments but parts of a nightly pattern, symbols of continuity, believed to safeguard against unrest in the hours of sleep. Music did not accompany this moment. Instead, silence prevailed, punctuated only by distant sounds. The faint call of a night bird, the whisper of leaves stirred by wind, the occasional creak of wooden beams adjusting to the cool of night. In this quiet, the queen reclined, her breath deepening, her gaze lingering upon the shadows cast upon the ceiling. She did not surrender to sleep immediately. The transition was slow, like the gradual fading of daylight into dusk. Outside her chamber, the palace itself settled. Guards took their stations with deliberate calm, their footsteps soft along colonnades. Servants withdrew into smaller quarters, their voices hushed as they shared modest evening meals. Lamps were extinguished in lesser halls, leaving only the main corridors faintly illuminated. The gardens, so bright in day, now lay under the watch of moonlight, the white blossoms of night-blooming flowers visible against the darkness, their fragrance drifting further in the cool air. Alexandria beyond the palace also rested, though never fully. From the harbor came the creak of moored ships, the ripple of water against hulls, and the soft murmur of men keeping watch. In narrow streets, families gathered in courtyards, their fires dimmed, their words carried quietly, as though in deference to the sleeping city. Dogs barked occasionally, then grew still. The great city, vibrant in day, now pulsed with a slower rhythm, one that echoed within the palace itself. In time, Cleopatra's eyes closed. The gauze curtains shifted gently with the breeze, their movement so light it seemed a dream already taking shape. The oil lamps were lowered, one by one, until only a faint glow remained, enough to outline the curve of a vessel, the edge of a curtain, the shimmer of a bronze basin. Darkness settled not as an intrusion but as a final layer of calm, completing the rhythm of the day. And thus, the Queen of Egypt rested, surrounded not by spectacle but by balance. Fragrance, silence, and the measured certainty that tomorrow would unfold with equal care. Within the quiet of her private chambers, Cleopatra's mind often wandered along paths that were neither hurried nor constrained. Scrolls lay unrolled across low tables, their edges curling gently, ink faded yet enduring with centuries of careful preservation. Each papyrus seemed to carry a world within it, histories of distant lands, philosophies penned by thinkers long gone, records of trade and law from regions both familiar and remote. Her fingers traced the surface lightly, absorbing the texture of knowledge as much as its content. She was drawn to words with a deliberate patience. The letters, whether Greek or Egyptian, demanded attention, and she gave it fully. Scribes had placed tablets nearby, already transcribed from older texts, and she read them slowly, lifting her gaze at intervals to consider the patterns they revealed. Numbers of taxes, records of harvests, or the migration of flocks were studied not merely for administration but as reflections of natural order, the rhythm that connected human labor with the cycles of the Nile. Music occupied her in another equally absorbing way. Lyres and flutes, often left unattended until she chose to draw them near, were instruments through which she could explore harmony, not merely as entertainment but as discipline. Fingers pressed strings and lips moved lightly to breath through reeds, the sound measured, the notes deliberate. These moments were private, yet each vibration of tone seemed to echo in the palace walls, reverberating faintly into distant corridors. Music offered her both solace and clarity, a medium in which thought and emotion converged. Languages, too, captivated her attention. Greek, Egyptian, and tongues of lands far beyond her borders were studied with exacting care. Scribes and tutors assisted, reading aloud slowly, repeating words until she could shape them herself. Each phrase learned was a bridge to understanding the people she governed and the distant cultures with which she negotiated. The act of speaking, of mastering the subtleties of sound and meaning, became both an intellectual exercise and a reflection of discipline, a testament to the precision she demanded of herself. Yet alongside these studies, Cleopatra maintained a sharp awareness of order and propriety. Her attention to detail extended to all within her chambers. Scribes who erred in transcription were corrected with firmness, their mistakes addressed not harshly, but with insistence that clarity and accuracy were paramount. Attendants who misplaced objects or disturbed the subtle arrangements of scrolls and instruments were guided back into precision. These were small exercises of discipline, executed quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet conveying the expectation that the environment, like the mind, must be shaped with care. In moments of reflection, she examined her own habits with equal scrutiny. Each day, she allotted hours to reading, to listening, to composing thoughts. Time was measured not in haste but in rhythm, allowing one pursuit to dissolve into the next with deliberate continuity. She observed how her attention shifted, how curiosity was sparked, and how discipline tempered indulgence. Nothing was left entirely to chance. Each decision, however minute, was framed within her own standards of order. Her fascination with the natural world often drew her to the smallest details. Insects that moved quietly through her gardens, the shifting patterns of light upon water, the subtle fragrance of a newly bloomed flower, each became a subject for observation, a point for contemplation. Even these minor attentions were approached with rigor. Notes might be made, sketches drawn, questions recorded to be explored later with scholars or alchemists. Knowledge was never trivial. It was a lattice connecting thought, governance, and understanding of life itself. Discipline and curiosity intertwined seamlessly. When a scroll proved particularly challenging, or when the melody of a musical exercise resisted immediate mastery, Cleopatra's patience was exacting. She repeated readings, rehearsed passages, and returned to problems until clarity was achieved. Her expectation of herself mirrored the discipline she demanded from her attendants and scribes. Mistakes were instructive, yet adherence to structure was never optional. In such moments, the palace around her seemed to fade. The hum of distant corridors, the faint clinking of bronze vessels, and the whisper of silk against stone became background to the focus she brought to her studies. Time stretched, not in quantity but in depth. Minutes and hours folded into an immersive exploration of thought, sound, and the unfolding patterns of knowledge. Occasionally, she paused to consult others, philosophers, astronomers, or physicians, engaging them in conversation with questions precise and deliberate. Each inquiry was formulated with intent, seeking not mere opinion but insight. Her intellect demanded engagement. She weighed responses carefully, tracing implications and testing assumptions. The act of questioning became an exercise in discipline, each exchange a reinforcement of her standards and a measure of her control over the breadth of understanding she sought. Even leisure, in its quietest forms, was intertwined with interest. A game of strategy might be approached with the same analytical mind as a study of philosophy. A walk in the garden was also a study in patterns. The growth of plants, the interplay of light and shadow, the architecture of fountains and pools. Each observation fed into the tapestry of knowledge she cultivated, blending curiosity with the meticulous precision that defined her nature. And so the hours passed, not with spectacle or public display, but with the measured unfolding of thought, music, language, and reflection. Cleopatra's personal pursuits were a testament to her inner discipline, revealing the ways in which curiosity, rigor, and self-imposed standards formed the true contours of her day. Her influence was not only in decree but in the careful shaping of intellect and environment alike, a quiet demonstration of power intertwined with profound personal cultivation. Cleopatra's attention to her surroundings extended beyond mere observation. It was a constant, quiet shaping of the household according to her exacting standards. Every movement of attendants, every placement of objects, every arrangement of scrolls and instruments was noted, not with haste or irritation, but with the careful eye of one attuned to order. Her scrutiny was both subtle and thorough, ensuring that the palace reflected the discipline she cultivated within herself. When a scribe's hand faltered, a tray tilted slightly, or a lamp was not positioned with proper symmetry, she intervened with measured precision. Instructions were given softly, often without raised voice, yet carrying an unmistakable weight. A glance, a gesture, or a single word could convey correction, prompting immediate attention and adjustment. Such guidance was never arbitrary. Each adjustment reinforced the rhythm and harmony she demanded, preserving the integrity of her household's functioning. Discipline, however, was not confined to minor errors. For those whose repeated carelessness threatened the smooth operation of her daily affairs, subtle penalties were imposed. A servant might be reassigned temporarily to simpler tasks, their oversight monitored with quiet attention, or a scribe's writing schedule recalibrated to ensure focus and accountability. These were not public reprimands but lessons in the expectation of precision, designed to cultivate diligence rather than fear. Her insistence on standards extended into every aspect of palace life. Linen was to be folded evenly, ink applied consistently, meals presented with care. Music and study followed rhythm as well. A note struck incorrectly, a passage misread, a phrase mispronounced, were noted and addressed. In these small corrections, she demonstrated both her knowledge and her authority, blending the personal cultivation of her own intellect with the refinement of those around her. Yet her demands were tempered by awareness and fairness. Cleopatra observed human limitations, recognizing fatigue, distraction, and the weight of labor. She distributed tasks thoughtfully, ensuring that her insistence on order did not become undue burden. Her presence conveyed both expectation and reassurance. The palace functioned smoothly because she demanded it, but it was guided with care and insight, not through arbitrary force. Even in matters of ceremony, she was precise. Attendants and courtiers alike were expected to follow patterns of posture, speech, and gesture that aligned with both tradition and her own standards. When missteps occurred, corrections were subtle yet clear, often delivered in private or with discretion. Each adjustment was a reinforcement of the discipline she cultivated, extending the quiet order of her own mind into the rhythm of the household. In these exercises of authority, Cleopatra demonstrated the balance of intellect and power. She did not rely solely upon her title but on the careful shaping of behavior, the cultivation of diligence, and the insistence upon refinement. Each act of correction, each directive, was infused with intention, reflecting a deep understanding of both human nature and the mechanisms by which order was preserved. The palace itself seemed to respond to this presence. Corridors echoed less with hasty movement and more with steady, mindful steps. Scrolls were placed in alignment, instruments readied with care, meals prepared in sequence and precision. Every detail, from the smallest ink-stained stylus to the placement of a water vessel, reflected the quiet insistence of the queen's discipline. Even those whose tasks were indirect, gardeners, musicians, scholars, felt the subtle shaping of her standards. The growth of a plant, the tuning of an instrument, the phrasing of a lecture, were all woven into the fabric of expectation she maintained. Corrections were neither loud nor abrupt, yet they carried clarity and permanence, teaching the household that precision, mindfulness, and diligence were inseparable from the life of the palace. Through this careful guidance, Cleopatra exercised authority not only as a ruler but as a master of environment and habit. Her discipline was a reflection of her inner rigor, a manifestation of her intellect, and an extension of the order she maintained within herself. It was neither spectacle nor show, but a quiet, pervasive shaping of those around her. A slow, deliberate, and enduring influence that left the palace aligned to the rhythms of her own mind. Within the quietude of her chambers, Cleopatra often engaged in practices that merged her intellectual curiosity with a subtle, exacting discipline. Scrolls and papyrus lay unrolled before her, their edges curling gently, and her stylus moved with deliberate care across wax tablets. She copied passages from philosophers, historians, and foreign chronicles, ensuring that every mark was precise, the lines of writing aligned evenly, each symbol a reflection of her own attentive hand. In these moments, she was both scholar and sovereign, shaping knowledge with the same meticulous care that she applied to the functioning of her household. Her interest in natural phenomena extended beyond casual observation. Instruments for measuring the stars, prepared by astronomers in her service, were brought into the chamber. Simple yet carefully calibrated devices indicated positions and patterns, allowing her to trace the slow movements of constellations and planets. She recorded observations in her own hand, notes arranged in tidy columns, diagrams annotated with small symbols that indicated recurring cycles. These were not idle amusements, but a disciplined pursuit of understanding the greater order of the world and its reflection in the life of her kingdom. In other quiet hours, she turned to the composition of small remedies and tinctures, guided by physicians and herbalists. Containers of dried herbs, crushed minerals, and fragrant oils were arranged carefully on low tables. Cleopatra measured each element with precision, noting proportions and effects, often blending combinations herself under the supervision of learned practitioners. Her interest was both practical and intellectual. She sought not only their effects but the knowledge of their properties, recording each experiment with care, so that the wisdom of one day might inform the practice of another. Amulets and charms were another area of meticulous attention. Small carvings, polished stones, and bound threads were assembled according to ritual and tradition. Cleopatra arranged them thoughtfully, sometimes inscribing minute symbols upon them herself, her hand steady and controlled. Each object carried significance, a reflection of order, protection, or intention. Their creation and placement were exercises in precision, linking her understanding of material craft with spiritual and symbolic discipline. She also kept diaries and records, private notes that detailed events, reflections, and insights. The pages were filled with careful lines of ink, each word chosen deliberately, each sentence balanced in rhythm and clarity. Some entries chronicled the behavior of scribes and attendants, noting improvements or lapses. Others explored ideas drawn from philosophical texts or astronomical observations. These writings were not for display but for the cultivation of memory and the sharpening of intellect, a personal archive of thought and reflection. Music, still a companion in these private pursuits, was engaged with in measured intervals. Lyres and flutes were drawn from their rests, their sounds practiced in fragments, repeated with attention to tone, rhythm, and subtlety. Even when the instruments were quiet, her mind traced patterns, reconstructing harmonies internally, testing sequences of notes, imagining melodies in relation to the moods and movements of the day. Each engagement demanded focus and patience, an exercise that both soothed and disciplined the intellect. Cleopatra's engagement with her environment, though intensely personal, remained bound by her standards of order. Scrolls and instruments were replaced in precise arrangements after use, residues of herbs carefully cleared, surfaces polished and aligned. Lamps were extinguished in sequence, water vessels emptied and restored, each motion executed with the same attention that marked her private rituals and her public oversight. In these careful repetitions, the queen exercised authority over her own space, her habits a subtle extension of her disciplined mind. Even small acts, such as arranging flowers in vases or setting small objects on tables, were imbued with deliberation. Each choice of placement was considered for symmetry, accessibility, and effect upon the mind. The scent, the color, and the alignment were all observed, reinforcing the notion that beauty, order, and function were inseparable. Through these minor but deliberate acts, the palace itself reflected the rhythm of her intellect and the precision of her habits. Through this combination of study, craft, observation, and reflection, Cleopatra maintained a constant cultivation of both knowledge and discipline. Her personal pursuits were never separate from the principles that guided her rule. Rather, they were extensions of the same rigor, a merging of curiosity, intellect, and exacting standards. Every gesture, every observation, every note inscribed carried significance, reinforcing the intricate balance of her inner life and the measured influence she exercised over those around her. Cleopatra's influence over her household extended far beyond mere supervision. It was woven into the very texture of daily life, a persistent presence felt in both subtle and deliberate ways. Every attendant, every scribe, every musician or scholar operated under the silent rhythm of her expectation. Her discipline was neither loud nor abrupt, but pervasive, shaping the palace's atmosphere in a manner that ensured order and mindfulness without the need for overt command. In the chambers where scrolls and tablets were maintained, her gaze was exacting. A scribe bent over a wax tablet, tracing letters with cautious precision, knew that a single error, however minor, could attract attention. Cleopatra did not raise her voice unnecessarily. Her observations were quiet but penetrating. She would pause, examining the formation of each symbol, the spacing of words, the alignment of lines. A gentle correction might follow, a word softly spoken, a finger tracing a misplaced mark, a request to adjust the stylus, but its impact was profound. Each scribe internalized the expectation. The queen's attention was a constant measure, and diligence was inseparable from their daily labor. Musicians, too, felt the contours of her authority. A note struck with careless timing, a phrase executed without clarity, was met with her serene scrutiny. She might lift a hand slightly, signaling attention, or pause the performance to suggest repetition. These interventions were measured, never hasty, yet carried absolute clarity. Precision was not optional. Through such quiet insistence, she instilled a discipline that was both rigorous and cultivated, a blending of her standards with the artistry of those she guided. Her methods were not confined to direct instruction. They included observation and subtle testing. Attendants were occasionally given tasks designed to reveal their attentiveness. A tray might be set with careful asymmetry to see if it would be corrected. A scroll might be placed slightly askew to test whether its orientation would be adjusted. These trials were never punitive in tone, but were lessons in mindfulness and careful observation. Cleopatra understood that the cultivation of order required not only correction but also the encouragement of foresight and initiative. She maintained a quiet register of those under her care. not through written lists alone, but through attentive memory, noting tendencies, strengths, and lapses. Certain scribes demonstrated precision but lacked initiative. Others moved quickly yet occasionally overlooked detail. Attendants varied in diligence and patience. The queen's corrections were tailored to individual temperaments. Firm guidance where habits were lax, subtle encouragement where uncertainty might falter, and reinforcement where consistency already shone. Each interaction was calibrated to produce improvement without fostering fear, preserving both respect and efficiency. In her private chambers, Cleopatra also pursued practices that reflected the same rigor she demanded of others. Scrolls and tablets were reviewed systematically, notes and diagrams annotated with meticulous care. Observations of the stars were recorded, cross-referenced, and examined for patterns. She maintained charts of celestial movements, tracing the gradual shifts with stylus and ink, noting correlations with seasonal changes, festivals, and administrative duties. Each record was methodical, reflecting a disciplined mind that sought to understand the broader order of the world while reinforcing the precision required in her immediate environment. Even in matters of culinary preparation, her oversight was precise. Dishes presented for her meals were not merely judged by taste, but by their composition, balance, and presentation. A stew might be examined for the evenness of its mixture, bread for uniform texture and color, wine for clarity and aroma. If a detail did not meet her expectation, the matter was addressed quietly but effectively. An attendant or cook would be guided to correct the lapse, ensuring that the palace's functions mirrored the order she cultivated in her own mind. Her discipline extended to the arrangement of her living spaces. Scrolls, instruments, vessels, and personal objects were arranged in deliberate symmetry. Each item had its place, and deviations were corrected promptly. The act of organizing was itself a reflection of her standards, an extension of her intellect into the material world. When a vase was slightly misaligned, a brush left out of place, or a cushion improperly folded, she intervened with the same calm precision she applied to intellectual exercises. A small gesture, a rearrangement, yet a reinforcement of her expectations. Cleopatra's interactions with scholars and physicians reflected her insistence on diligence and accuracy. When presenting questions, she did so with deliberate clarity, probing for details, testing assumptions, and evaluating the consistency of responses. Answers were weighed carefully, discrepancies were noted, and further inquiry requested. Such engagement was exacting yet not arbitrary. It was rooted in her desire for knowledge, the cultivation of intellect, and the maintenance of precise understanding. Those under her instruction learned to anticipate her scrutiny, to offer evidence, and to prepare with care. Her standards were equally evident in the palace gardens. Plants were tended not only for beauty but according to careful observation of growth, hydration, and sunlight. Gardeners were instructed on the spacing of seeds, the trimming of branches, the alignment of pathways. When errors occurred, corrections were subtle yet unmistakable. A branch repositioned, a row straightened, a flower pruned to restore balance. Through these measured interventions, the queen reinforced the principle that diligence and attention to detail were essential, even in the apparently tranquil domain of flora. The discipline she maintained was not only procedural but also moral and intellectual. Courtiers, philosophers, and attendants alike were guided toward reflection, careful speech, and measured behavior. Casual errors in discourse or logic were addressed privately. Attention to detail was instilled as a matter of habit and character. These exercises were neither harsh nor ostentatious. They were quiet, persistent, and effective, shaping the culture of the palace in accordance with her exacting mind. Even the smallest of rituals were observed with rigor. Writing instruments were aligned precisely before use, inkpots cleaned and positioned consistently, wax tablets smoothed evenly. Music was prepared methodically, instruments tuned with care, notes practiced repeatedly. Herbal mixtures were measured exactly, their proportions recorded, effects noted, and lessons transcribed for future reference. Each act, no matter how minor, reflected a principle that governed both her personal habits and the behavior of those around her. Precision, mindfulness, and diligence were inseparable from excellence. Her vigilance also extended to ceremonial occasions. Attendants and courtiers were expected to move with quiet deliberation, observe posture and decorum, and execute gestures with precision. If a misstep occurred, correction was immediate yet discreet. A hand gently guided, a foot repositioned, a voice suggested an adjustment. These interventions were never public displays of authority but subtle, effective means of maintaining order. The palace itself became a living reflection of her standards, every movement aligned to her measured expectations. Even when alone, Cleopatra maintained her discipline. Scrolls reviewed, instruments tuned, charts annotated, and observations recorded. Every engagement with her interests was precise. The combination of curiosity and exacting habit shaped her intellect and reflected in the structure of her daily life. Mistakes were noted and corrected, patterns examined and adjusted, all in pursuit of mastery over both knowledge and environment. Her private diligence was inseparable from the authority she exercised publicly, a continuous and subtle reinforcement of her personal and political ethos. Through these practices, Cleopatra's influence was comprehensive and enduring. Attendants internalized her standards, scholars anticipated her scrutiny, and musicians and artists refined their work under her quiet yet persistent guidance. Her discipline was both personal and environmental, shaping thought, action, and space simultaneously. Each correction, each guidance, each insistence on precision reinforced a culture of mindfulness, reflection, and responsibility that extended from her chambers to the palace gardens, from the libraries to the kitchens, permeating every facet of life under her roof. In this way, the Queen's presence was ever perceptible. It was not loud or imposing, but constant, an intricate weave of expectation, observation, and correction. Every act she performed, every attention to detail, every quiet exercise of authority reinforced the discipline that underpinned her household. Those within the palace adapted naturally to the rhythm she maintained, understanding that diligence and attentiveness were valued above haste or negligence. Her influence, precise and measured, became an invisible yet unmistakable framework within which all activity flowed. Even as evening light faded and the palace settled into quiet, the effects of her discipline persisted. Scribes completed tasks with care, instruments were returned to precise positions, tables and vessels aligned, and the air itself seemed imbued with a sense of order. The subtle insistence on attention and mindfulness, first demonstrated through observation and correction, had woven itself into the daily rhythm of those who served and studied under her gaze. Through these continuous and deliberate acts, Cleopatra reinforced the inseparability of curiosity, intellect, and discipline. Her household, carefully shaped by both expectation and instruction, mirrored the clarity and precision of her mind. Every interaction, every correction, every moment of guidance was part of a larger pattern. The cultivation of a space, a people, and a self in which thought, action, and attention were held to the highest standard. The palace, in its quiet grandeur, reflected the order she demanded of herself and of all who shared her world, a living testament to the power of exacting yet measured authority. Cleopatra's pursuits extended naturally from discipline into the realms of art, science, and the delicate investigations of nature. Her curiosity, always tempered by rigorous attention, found expression in meticulous experiments with herbs, minerals, and other natural substances. In quiet chambers filled with the scent of crushed flowers and earthy powders, she prepared mixtures designed to explore both practical effects and theoretical principles. Jars of dried leaves, carefully labeled, rested beside small mortars and pestles. Minerals of various colors, each weighed and recorded, were combined in precise proportions under her watchful eye. She was particularly attentive to the subtleties of alchemy as understood in her time, observing reactions between substances with patience and care. A change in color, a shift in texture, the release of scent or heat, none escaped her notice. Notes were taken meticulously on papyrus scrolls, diagrams drawn to trace outcomes and compare them with previous experiments. Each entry was organized, indexed, and often cross-referenced with earlier observations, producing a continuous record of her intellectual curiosity in material form. Her interest in medicine was equally precise. Consultations with physicians provided opportunities to test ideas, examine the properties of plants and minerals, and understand their effects on the body. Cleopatra carefully measured doses, observed reactions, and recorded findings in her own hand. The interplay between observation, measurement, and reflection mirrored her discipline in other aspects of life, merging curiosity with responsibility. The Queen's experiments were deliberate, controlled, and insightful, demonstrating a blend of intellect and practical engagement rarely seen in private chambers. Art and decoration also captured her attention, but always in conjunction with thoughtful analysis. She sketched designs for jewelry, furniture, and ceremonial vessels, not only for aesthetic purposes, but to explore symmetry, proportion, and function. Patterns were measured, colors tested, and arrangements noted, with meticulous attention to balance and harmony. Every brushstroke or engraving was accompanied by reflection, consideration of material properties, and awareness of its effect within the larger context of her environment. Even the smallest design, once completed, was carefully documented, often alongside comparative sketches or notes from previous experiments in color and form. Music remained a companion in these investigations, providing both rhythm and reflection. Lyres and flutes were tuned and played with careful attention, each note measured for clarity, resonance, and harmony. When melodies were composed, she considered both the theoretical structure and the emotional effect, testing sequences repeatedly, refining transitions, and noting their impact in writing. Music, like her other pursuits, was approached methodically, yet it retained the element of creativity and personal expression that enlivened the rigor of her routine. Her chambers were arranged to facilitate this blend of discipline and creativity. Tables were cleared and prepared for experiments, instruments and scrolls positioned for immediate access, and light sources adjusted to illuminate work without strain. Jars, scrolls, and instruments were labeled, cataloged, and stored according to system and habit. Every object, every tool, every reference point was integrated into a framework of order that allowed her curiosity to flourish within boundaries of precision. In these hours, Cleopatra's influence on her attendants and scholars became evident not only through instruction but through example. Observers noted the Queen's meticulous methods, the care with which she measured and recorded, the patience she demonstrated with materials and people alike. The discipline she cultivated in herself inspired diligence in others. Her silent insistence on attention to detail shaped both the work and mindset of those around her. The palace, in these quiet chambers, became a laboratory, a studio, and a library simultaneously, a living reflection of her intellect and the exacting standards she imposed on all endeavors. Even small observations in nature were treated with similar rigor. Flowers were dissected for study, leaves compared for color and texture, roots examined for structure. Insects and small animals, carefully observed and recorded, became subjects of analysis, each behavior and pattern noted in detail. Nothing was overlooked. Each small discovery contributed to the expanding mosaic of knowledge that Cleopatra cultivated. Her creative and scientific work often intersected with ritual and symbolism. Amulets, charms, and ceremonial objects were designed with attention to both aesthetic form and intended effect. Ingredients selected for medicinal or protective properties were combined with consideration for harmony and proportion, reflecting her belief that beauty, efficacy, and precision were inseparable. Each creation, whether functional or symbolic, was approached with the same meticulous care that marked her studies in medicine, music, and natural philosophy. In these pursuits, the queen exercised a combination of patience, exactitude, and thoughtful imagination. Mistakes were noted and analyzed. Successes were recorded and sometimes refined further. Every experiment, sketch, or melody was part of a larger pattern of inquiry and reflection. Through repetition, observation, and careful documentation, she not only cultivated knowledge but demonstrated the value of discipline, attention, and persistence. Even as she engaged in these activities, the palace around her remained aligned with her standards. Attendants observed her methods, adjusted their own work accordingly, and often anticipated her needs. Scribes and musicians adapted to the pace and requirements she set, learning to integrate precision into their own practice. In this way, the environment itself became an extension of her disciplined curiosity, a network of attentiveness and order that supported her work and reflected her influence. Cleopatra's dedication to these personal interests was not a distraction from governance, but a complement to it. Her studies in natural phenomena, medicine, and alchemy provided insight into practical administration, while her explorations in art and music cultivated discernment and taste. The combination of creativity, analysis, and meticulous attention allowed her to engage fully with the world, shaping both her personal development and the functioning of her court. The quietude of these hours offered a rhythm distinct from the ceremonial and administrative duties of the day. Time was measured not by obligation but by immersion in thought, experiment, and observation. Each action, whether turning a page, adjusting an instrument, or mixing a substance, was deliberate, methodical, and purposeful. The resulting pattern of activity reflected the unity of her mind and hand, her capacity to blend discipline with curiosity, and her insistence on exactitude across all domains of life. Through this integration of intellect, discipline, and creativity, Cleopatra established a model of personal authority that extended beyond decree and command. Her attention to detail, careful observation, and rigorous method were mirrored in the behavior and habits of those around her. Scribes, musicians, attendants, and scholars learned to value precision, mindfulness, and patience, recognizing in the Queen's example the inseparable link between discipline and achievement. Even as evening descended and the palace gradually quieted, the effects of her meticulous practice persisted. Scrolls remained neatly organized, instruments returned to precise positions, and mixtures prepared during the day were cataloged and stored. The rhythms of her work, imbued with order and care, left a lasting imprint upon the spaces she inhabited and the people who observed her methods. Through patience, precision, and consistent attention, Cleopatra ensured that curiosity, creativity, and discipline coexisted seamlessly, forming the foundation of both personal growth and the effective management of her household. Her experiments, compositions, and observations, though conducted largely in private, were not isolated. They were intertwined with her role as ruler, reflecting an understanding that knowledge, method, and meticulous care were forms of power. Every measured movement, every careful note, every observation made under her scrutiny reinforced a culture of discipline, awareness, and excellence that extended from her personal pursuits into the daily operations of the palace. Through these combined practices, Cleopatra demonstrated a synthesis of personal passion, intellectual rigor, and exacting discipline. Her engagement with the world was deliberate, reflective, and exacting. Her curiosity shaped by standards of precision. Her creativity guided by rules of harmony and proportion. The palace, in its stillness, mirrored these values. Every object, every action, every lesson a reflection of the queen's mind, exacting yet inspired, disciplined yet alive with curiosity. Within the private chambers of her palace, Cleopatra's influence took on forms more intricate and subtle than the strict discipline she maintained over her attendants and scholars. Here, the measured authority of the queen intertwined with desires, whims, and impulses that reflected the full spectrum of her character. In these moments, the careful order of the palace became both a stage and a canvas, where the queen could exert control not only over actions but over responses, observing the delicate interplay of obedience, hesitation, and compliance. Some practices were designed to test loyalty and attentiveness, though the motivations were not always purely administrative. A scribe might be asked to retrieve a scroll at an unexpected hour, their response observed with careful scrutiny. The queen noted not merely efficiency but subtle cues: hesitation, posture, expression. The same attentiveness applied to attendants performing mundane tasks. A misstep, a glance held too long, a movement too slow, each could elicit a measured correction. Yet sometimes the correction carried dual purpose, blending guidance with subtle assertion of personal authority, a private reminder of her dominance within the household. Cleopatra's enjoyment of control often intertwined with moments of personal indulgence. Certain arrangements of her chambers, the placement of cushions, the adjustment of light, even the timing of meals, were designed to create situations in which her attendants' attentiveness could be tested. Those who served her learned quickly that their every motion could become part of a subtle ritual, a quiet game of observation where precision was required not merely for discipline but for the satisfaction of the queen's exacting and sometimes capricious standards. At times, these patterns of control revealed a darker dimension of her authority. A misaligned instrument, a delayed response, or a lapse in decorum could result not merely in correction but in a deeper, more personal scrutiny. Cleopatra's gaze, deliberate and unhurried, traced the minutiae of movement, posture, and expression. She assessed character, endurance, and susceptibility to guidance, her own impulses shaping the way she engaged with those around her. The interplay of obedience and her personal satisfaction became a nuanced dance, a subtle manifestation of power that required careful attention from her attendants. Her private indulgences were often carefully concealed beneath the veneer of routine and ritual. When preparing for quiet hours, she would arrange objects and instruments in precise order, yet some placements were intended less for practical use than to establish a scenario in which her attendants' attentiveness, discretion, and reactions could be gauged. A glance, a hesitation, a carefully measured step could be observed, noted, and later referenced in the shaping of behavior. Even the act of moving through her chambers carried potential for subtle exercises of control, blending authority with personal curiosity. Cleopatra's use of observation and influence extended into matters of intimacy and subtle dominance. Attendants, both male and female, were drawn into her private routines not merely for service, but as participants in carefully structured displays of expectation and compliance. A simple task, fetching a basin, adjusting a garment, presenting a scroll, could become a test of attentiveness, patience, or deference. The queen's interest was not arbitrary. It was rooted in a precise understanding of human behavior, a recognition of how desire, fear, respect, and curiosity intersected. In moments of private indulgence, she might orchestrate interactions that were at once playful, commanding, and, at times, subtly manipulative. Those in her service learned to anticipate the queen's expectations, balancing the need for precision with awareness of her personal inclinations. Cleopatra's pleasure in such control was quiet yet exacting, a reflection of her intellect and her recognition of the power inherent in observation. Every gesture, glance, or word could carry layered meaning, intertwining routine with a subtle assertion of dominance that reinforced her authority while satisfying her private whims. These practices were always conducted within a rhythm of measured control. The palace's silence, the soft glow of lamps, the muted sense of oils and incense, and the gentle hum of distant activity all contributed to an environment in which the queen could exercise both discipline and desire. Attendants became part of a living tableau, their movements, expressions, and attentiveness forming an unspoken dialogue with her own impulses. Through this interplay, Cleopatra maintained mastery not only of the physical space but of the psychological landscape of her household. At times, her curiosity extended into experimentation with emotional and social dynamics. A servant might be given a task that required initiative or judgment, then observed to see how they managed responsibility and pressure. The queen's evaluation was unhurried. She noted subtle shifts in confidence, hesitation, and expression. Some responses pleased her, aligning with her expectations of discipline and refinement, while others prompted further instruction, redirection, or correction. The satisfaction derived from these observations was nuanced, combining intellectual engagement with the assertion of personal influence over those around her. Cleopatra's darker inclinations were never openly displayed. They were woven into the fabric of everyday life, subtle, pervasive, and measured. The blending of authority with private satisfaction, of discipline with personal whim, created an environment in which obedience, attentiveness, and awareness were continuously tested. Her power, though exercised quietly, was profound, influencing behavior, shaping habit, and satisfying impulses in ways that were both private and pervasive. Even as the hours passed, these dynamics continued in quiet patterns. Attendants moved with careful deliberation, mindful of the queen's presence, aware that their actions might be scrutinized not only for efficiency, but for subtler measures of compliance, composure, and sensitivity. Each action, no matter how minor, was embedded within a larger framework of expectation and control, reinforcing the pervasive influence of Cleopatra's authority in both visible and hidden ways. Her enjoyment of control and subtle manipulation was intertwined with intellectual curiosity. Observation of behavior, analysis of reactions, and assessment of readiness or hesitation were exercises in understanding human nature, reinforcing both her strategic thinking and her private satisfaction. Through these carefully calibrated interactions, the queen not only maintained order, but explored the limits of influence and the dynamics of desire, testing both her own understanding and the responsiveness of those around her. In private chambers, these patterns were heightened by intimacy of presence and the control of environment. Lighting, scent, arrangement of objects, and the timing of tasks all contributed to scenarios in which the queen could observe attentiveness, responsiveness, and discretion. Every gesture, posture, and glance became part of an intricate tapestry of influence, reinforcing her authority while providing personal satisfaction. The interplay of control, observation, and private indulgence created a space in which discipline and desire were inseparable, a microcosm of power exercised with subtlety and precision. Cleopatra's methods of influence extended to both mental and emotional domains. She understood the effect of anticipation, restraint, and delayed gratification. Attendants learned to navigate expectations with care, recognizing that her attention could shift from strict discipline to nuanced observation, blending correction with subtle reward or recognition. These interactions were never impulsive. They were measured, deliberate, and continuous, forming a rhythm that intertwined obedience with subtle psychological engagement. Even in moments of personal satisfaction, her influence remained pervasive. Tasks performed in response to her whims reinforced awareness, attentiveness, and precision. Simple acts, holding an object, adjusting a garment, preparing a surface, became exercises in understanding boundaries, timing, and the interplay of observation and response. Cleopatra's control, exercised quietly, ensured that her personal indulgences were inseparable from her broader authority, blending desire with discipline, curiosity with strategic observation, and pleasure with the cultivation of attentiveness. Through these subtle practices, the queen's household operated as a carefully calibrated environment, balancing order with private exploration of impulses. Attendants, scribes, and musicians internalized patterns of expectation, learning to anticipate needs, observe nuance, and respond with precision. Cleopatra's darker inclinations were never chaotic. They were integrated into a framework of control and observation, ensuring that her private desires reinforced rather than undermined the order of her palace. In this way, Cleopatra's character emerged as complex and multidimensional. Discipline, intellect, curiosity, and private indulgence coexisted seamlessly. Her power, though exercised quietly and often invisibly, shaped behavior, influenced habits, and satisfied personal impulses with subtlety and precision. The palace, in its measured calm and carefully maintained rhythm, reflected the unity of authority and desire, intellect and whim, order and indulgence, forming a living portrait of a ruler whose personal and private influence was as exacting as it was profound. Even as night deepened, and the palace settled into shadows, the effects of her presence remained palpable. Attendants moved with careful attention, instruments and scrolls were aligned, and the scent of oils lingered in the air. Every element of the environment echoed the subtle exercises of influence and observation conducted throughout the day, a quiet yet persistent reflection of the queen's complex character, both disciplined and indulgent, exacting and personal, measured and private. Cleopatra's private hours unfolded with deliberate, measured attention, a delicate balance between curiosity, indulgence, and subtle assertion of authority. Within the quiet confines of her chambers, every object, every arrangement, and every interaction carried layered meaning. Attendants, familiar with her exacting standards, moved with careful deliberation, their gestures shaped as much by anticipation as by instruction. Here, the queen's influence extended beyond discipline into the nuanced orchestration of personal satisfaction and control. In these moments, simple tasks became instruments of observation. A servant asked to adjust a lamp, smooth a cushion, or lay out a scroll would often find the request accompanied by a subtle test. A misalignment introduced deliberately, a phrase phrased ambiguously, a placement left slightly uncertain. Cleopatra's eyes, slow and unhurried, traced every response, noting hesitation, initiative, or minute shifts in posture. Such examinations were never loud or confrontational. They were quiet, pervasive, and calculated, producing awareness and responsiveness in those who served her. The queen's enjoyment of these subtle manipulations intertwined with her personal indulgences. At times, she orchestrated small, private rituals designed to please herself while simultaneously exercising influence over her attendants. A simple gesture, a carefully timed glance, a gentle touch, a shift of posture, was observed for reaction, measured against expectation, and recorded silently in memory. These exercises were precise, deliberate, and imbued with psychological insight, revealing her capacity to merge intellect, desire, and authority seamlessly. Some habits reflected a fascination with the human response to attention and restraint. Attendants might be instructed to hold a position or maintain a task for extended periods, their endurance observed with quiet scrutiny. Compliance and hesitation alike were noted, each providing insight into character, temperament, and subtle susceptibility to influence. Cleopatra's satisfaction was never impulsive. It arose from the slow accumulation of observation and the quiet confirmation of control, the knowledge that her presence shaped behavior in intricate and enduring ways. In other moments, her attention turned to sensory indulgences. Oils, perfumes, and incense were arranged with careful thought, their scents layered to create subtle effects. Attendants were tasked with maintaining the precise balance of aroma, temperature, and light, each correction and adjustment reinforcing both discipline and attentiveness. The queen's pleasure in the arrangement of her environment was intertwined with her quiet assertion of authority, a demonstration of the inseparability of personal satisfaction and control over those around her. Cleopatra's games of observation extended to social and psychological dimensions. She would invite a small circle of trusted attendants or confidants into her private chambers, creating scenarios in which their responses could be evaluated. A question might be phrased ambiguously, a task partially defined, or a position of authority subtly tested. Each interaction provided insight into loyalty, initiative, and composure, while simultaneously satisfying the queen's curiosity and private inclinations. These exercises were measured, deliberate, and infused with subtle pleasure, demonstrating her capacity for both intellect and intricate control. Her indulgences often included orchestrated moments of tension and anticipation. Attendants, instructed to prepare or adjust an object, might pause under her gaze, unsure of the precise expectation. Cleopatra observed quietly, noting their movements, gestures, and expressions, savoring both the compliance and the slight uncertainty inherent in human response. The satisfaction derived from these moments was complex. It combined observation, intellectual engagement, and the quiet fulfillment of personal desire, a seamless blending of authority and indulgence. Even her private amusements adhered to her principles of precision. Instruments were handled with care, materials measured meticulously, and tasks executed in deliberate sequence. Nothing was left to chance. Every element of her environment contributed to a controlled experience in which pleasure, curiosity, and influence intersected. Attendants, deeply familiar with her expectations, learned to anticipate subtle cues, responding with a mixture of attentiveness, caution, and initiative, each action reinforcing the queen's pervasive authority. In these hours, her capacity for manipulation and subtle dominance was exercised with artistry. Small rewards, a smile, a nod, a gentle acknowledgement, were given with careful timing, reinforcing desired behavior and heightening attentiveness. Corrections were measured and private, never arbitrary, their effect magnified by the quiet precision with which they were delivered. Cleopatra's understanding of human psychology was evident in the seamless integration of guidance, observation, and personal satisfaction. Her fascination with control extended to ritualized indulgences as well. Objects, aromas, and arrangements were chosen and positioned to elicit responses, maintain attention, and heighten awareness. Tasks that might appear mundane, a cloth folded, a basin carried, a scroll positioned, were transformed into exercises in precision and psychological engagement. Through these careful orchestrations, she maintained both order and private satisfaction, weaving discipline and desire into an inseparable pattern. Attendants, scholars, and musicians alike became participants in a living tableau, their movements, responses, and composure reflecting the subtleties of the queen's influence. Mistakes were corrected quietly, compliance reinforced through subtle gestures, and attentiveness cultivated through persistent, gentle scrutiny. Cleopatra's private practices demonstrated that authority, desire, and intellect could coexist, each enhancing the others, producing a rhythm of engagement that was both disciplined and intimate. Even the smallest interactions carried layered significance. A servant holding a tray, a musician adjusting an instrument, a scribe positioning a tablet. All were observed, assessed, and integrated into the quiet exercises of influence that defined her private life. Cleopatra's enjoyment derived not merely from the execution of tasks, but from the responses they elicited, the subtle confirmation of her power and the interplay of attention, restraint, and psychological engagement. Her private spaces were arranged to facilitate these exercises. Light, scent, and sound were controlled with precision, creating environments in which observation and influence could be maximized. Each object, each instrument, each vessel was positioned for accessibility, effect, and subtle control, reflecting the integration of personal pleasure with authority. The palace, in these quiet chambers, became a landscape of influence, where the queen's desires and standards were enacted continuously and deliberately. Through these careful practices, Cleopatra maintained mastery over both environment and psyche. Attendants internalized patterns of behavior, learning to anticipate expectations, navigate subtle tests, and respond with precision. The queen's satisfaction, whether derived from observation, subtle manipulation, or orchestrated rituals, reinforced attentiveness and compliance, shaping the household into a finely tuned extension of her will. Even as night deepened and shadows lengthened, the traces of these practices persisted. Objects remained aligned, instruments positioned with care, and the subtle effects of light, scent, and temperature continued to influence mood and perception. Attendants moved with quiet deliberation, their awareness of the queen's expectations shaping each step, gesture, and glance. The palace itself reflected the seamless integration of discipline, observation, and personal indulgence that characterized Cleopatra's private hours. In these interwoven practices of control, pleasure, and observation, the queen's character revealed itself in full complexity. Discipline, intellect, curiosity, and private satisfaction coexisted, each reinforcing the other. The palace, though silent, carried the echoes of her authority and influence. Every gesture, every adjustment, every subtle exercise of power leaving a quiet, persistent imprint. Cleopatra's private life was an intricate balance of order, observation, and indulgence. A realm where intellect met desire and discipline intertwined with personal fulfillment, forming a living portrait of a ruler both exacting and profoundly human. The quiet of the palace, softened by the dim glow of oil lamps and the faint fragrance of incense, allowed Cleopatra's world to unfold in its most private dimensions. The meticulous routines, the exacting attention to every detail, and the measured discipline of her household converged with more intimate pursuits, revealing the queen's most personal inclinations. Within this sphere, observation, authority, and personal desire blended seamlessly, shaping both the environment and the individuals within it. Certain moments were devoted solely to the exploration of pleasure, reflection, and control, a realm where discipline and indulgence were indistinguishable. Cleopatra's private chambers became a stage upon which the interplay of obedience, anticipation, and subtle manipulation could be enacted. Attendants, chosen carefully for trust and discretion, moved with precise attention, their gestures and postures observed, measured, and occasionally corrected. Even these interactions were infused with subtle psychological nuance, revealing both the queen's understanding of human behavior and her private delight in influence. Small rituals, conducted at leisure, combined sensory detail with attentive control. Oils and scented waters were arranged to create layered fragrances, lamps positioned to cast gentle shadows, and fabrics draped to enhance texture and visual harmony. Each element was not merely decorative. It was a tool, a measure of attentiveness, and a means of shaping the mood of the room. Attendants participated as both servants and observers, their actions subtly guided to align with the queen's precise expectations, producing both practical function and personal gratification for Cleopatra. The queen's indulgences often intersected with her fascination with the human response to authority. Tasks that might otherwise appear mundane. A tray presented, a scroll adjusted, a cushion fluffed, became exercises in attention, endurance, and discretion. Cleopatra observed without haste, noting the minutest hesitation, the smallest gesture of initiative, the tone of compliance or subtle resistance. Each reaction was a reflection of both character and training, the private satisfaction of the queen intertwined with her perception of loyalty, poise, and subtle adaptability. Intimate moments unfolded with deliberate slowness, a rhythm shaped by observation, subtle manipulation, and personal curiosity. Cleopatra's attendants, carefully selected and trained, became participants in experiences that were both instructive and private, blending the queen's fascination with control, human behavior, and personal gratification. Each exercise, each interaction, each gesture was integrated into a broader framework of attentiveness and influence, producing a microcosm of authority and intimacy within the palace's private spaces. Even in these intimate pursuits, attention to detail remained paramount. The positioning of objects, the timing of movements, the modulation of light and scent, and the sequencing of actions were all calibrated to produce desired responses and enhance the queen's experience. Nothing was left to chance. Every aspect of the environment, every act of service, and every observed reaction was part of a carefully constructed pattern, a reflection of the intersection between discipline, curiosity, and personal indulgence. Cleopatra's interest in subtle domination and observation extended beyond physical tasks into mental and emotional engagement. Questions posed to attendants, scholars, or musicians were sometimes ambiguous, requiring initiative and discernment. The responses were observed closely, measured against expectation, and integrated into her understanding of the individual's character. Each interaction, each subtle correction, each acknowledgement or gentle encouragement reinforced attentiveness, while also satisfying the queen's desire for insight into human nature. Within the sanctuary of her private quarters, Cleopatra also pursued knowledge and experimentation in parallel with indulgence. Herbal mixtures, tinctures, and oils were prepared with meticulous care, their effects noted and recorded. Minerals and pigments were combined for artistic or ritual purposes, studied for properties and potential uses. Instruments of measurement, observation, and calculation were engaged thoughtfully, blending intellectual curiosity with personal engagement. These activities were not idle diversions but disciplined practices that reflected the queen's unyielding attention to precision, even in the most private moments. In combination with these pursuits, Cleopatra's personal pleasures were shaped by a careful orchestration of environment, expectation, and response. Attendants were guided to anticipate needs, adjust positions, and maintain composure, while the queen observed subtle cues and reactions. The satisfaction derived from these engagements was multi-layered, a blend of personal gratification, intellectual engagement, and affirmation of authority. Through deliberate control, she ensured that every private indulgence reinforced the order and attentiveness that characterized her household. At times, games of power and observation took on elaborate forms. A single request, a seemingly simple task, or a carefully arranged scenario could reveal much about readiness, poise, or psychological resilience. Cleopatra's enjoyment was derived not only from the fulfillment of her desires, but from the intricate process of observing, guiding, and refining behavior. Attendants learned to navigate these subtle dynamics with caution and attentiveness, their actions reflecting both the queen's exacting standards and her personal inclinations. Even in moments of rest or leisure, her influence remained pervasive. Music was played or contemplated with attention to harmony and subtle effect, instruments positioned and tuned with care. Scrolls and notes, partially drafted or prepared for study, were arranged to enhance engagement and reflection. Every aspect of the environment, from the texture of cushions to the layering of fragrances, contributed to a controlled and deliberate experience in which personal satisfaction and authority were intertwined. The rhythm of these hours was unhurried, deliberate, and immersive. Cleopatra's private indulgences, her subtle exercises of influence, and her intellectual pursuits all converged in a seamless continuum. Attendants, while serving, became participants in a living tableau, their movements, gestures, and attentiveness continuously observed and guided. Each action was integrated into a broader structure of discipline, desire, and curiosity, reflecting the depth and complexity of the queen's character. In the stillness of night, the palace itself seemed to echo the imprint of her influence. Objects remained arranged, instruments and vessels aligned, fragrances lingering in the air, and the soft illumination casting delicate shadows. Attendants moved quietly, their awareness shaped by long familiarity with the queen's patterns of expectation, their actions reinforcing the subtle exercises of observation and authority that had defined the day. In this environment, order, discipline, and personal indulgence coexisted harmoniously, producing a sense of continuity and quiet mastery. Cleopatra's private practices, though sometimes indulgent or secretive, were always conducted with the same careful attention and deliberation that marked her public life. Observation, control, and reflection were inseparable from personal satisfaction, each reinforcing the other. The palace, though tranquil, bore witness to a continuous interplay of intellect, desire, and authority, each aspect of her character expressed in the careful orchestration of space, action, and reaction. Even as night deepened into silence, the queen's influence remained tangible. Attendants, scholars, and musicians rested or prepared for the next day, their movements shaped by familiarity with her expectations. Objects and instruments retained the precision she required, and the air itself seemed attuned to the rhythm of her private presence. In these final hours, the blending of curiosity, control, indulgence, and discipline formed a quiet, enduring reflection of the queen's complete character, leaving a lasting imprint upon both her environment and those who shared it. The private and the public, the disciplined and the indulgent, the observant and the satisfied, coalesced into a portrait of Cleopatra that was at once complex, intimate, and profoundly human. Her life, lived with meticulous attention and exacting standards, had balanced intellect, curiosity, and desire, shaping the palace, the household, and the individuals within it. Every gesture, every correction, every quiet observation had contributed to the continuity of her authority and the cultivation of attentiveness, ensuring that the fabric of her world reflected both her power and her intricate personality. As dawn approached, light softening through the chambers, Cleopatra's routines gradually shifted toward reflection and rest. Instruments were returned to their places, scrolls carefully rolled or set aside, and attendants, seasoned by observation and expectation, quietly withdrew. The palace, arranged with meticulous care, stood as a testament to her life of discipline, curiosity, and private indulgence. In the stillness, the accumulated effects of her presence, the order, the attentiveness, the quiet assertion of authority, lingered in every corner, a silent but enduring echo of a life lived with precision, awareness, and depth. And so, in the gentle unfolding of her hours, both private and observed, the queen's days came to a measured close. The interplay of control and indulgence, discipline and desire, curiosity and personal satisfaction left an indelible mark upon the household, the palace, and the memory of those who served and observed her. Cleopatra's life, a tapestry of intellect, rigor, and intimate authority, concluded in harmony with the rhythms she had cultivated, leaving a final impression of quiet mastery, reflective depth, and the complex, enduring presence of a ruler who commanded attention, curiosity, and respect in every aspect of her world.